Well, hello. Today we are going to be looking at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. We're continuing our overview summary in the Old Testament, where over the course of 8 weeks, we're looking at a range of Old Testament texts that are intended to begin laying a foundation for thinking about the issues surrounding systemic racism. So ethnicity, sin, repentance, etc. Today, as I said, we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. This is the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, first, a quick note about pronunciation. Technically, it is supposed to be pronounced Babel. However, as a child, I grew up learning the story Tower of Babel, and I just cannot train myself to say it that way. So if I switch back and forth, it's because I'm trying, but old habits die hard. Now, this text is one that we're often taught in Sunday school, but then not again. Our lectionary, which here at Truro we preach through on Sundays, doesn't include it in regular readings. And I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon on the Tower of Babel. And yet, it is here that the idea of multiple languages is introduced. And that's why we're looking at it today in this series as we think about ethnicity, as we begin to lay a foundation for how we might think about systemic racism. It's because here, the idea of multiple languages is introduced. In fact, Babel is often referenced in correlation to discussions around tongues and Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, which we'll get to in a few months. Now, it's a complicated text. Commentators are not sure what to do with it. They don't all agree. However, I wonder if it may prove helpful for us as we wrestle with God's design when it comes to diversity. Before we dive in, though, we have to, as always, look at the context. So let's just look briefly at the texts that surround Genesis chapter 11, 1 through 9. First, in Genesis 10, we're going to zoom out. Genesis 10 describes the nations descended from Noah. And in Genesis 12, we zoom in on the person of Abram, who's going to become Abraham, the person to whom and with whom God makes a covenant that he might be a blessing to the nations. And so this text is sandwiched between two discussions of the nations, of diversity. And so I think that's important. That's important context for us as we think about what exactly is happening here in this story. Picking it up, Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now, the whole earth, the author of Genesis writes, had one language and the same words. This is the first question we must ask ourselves. Is it a problem that the whole earth had one language and the same words? Verse 2, as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Now this location, Shinar, the plains of Shinar, is the Fertile Crescent. Tigris, Euphrates, it's towards the south. It's actually in the same region as which is where Abram is going to be found. Verse 4, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. All right, let's pause there. For the people who have gathered in the plain of Shinar, there's a plan, and there's three parts to the plan. The first, we're going to build a city and a tower to the heavens. Second, we're going to make a name for ourselves. And third, we're going to avoid being dispersed over the face of the earth. Verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they will all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Here's the question I want to ask here. What is God worried about in this moment? What's the problem God is trying to solve? There's something here that is bad for them. Could it be that the problem is that they're one people and one language, and not just that nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them? And so God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. Again, we've got references here, as the church fathers note, to the Trinity. And so the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Now, whatever the problem is, God goes about solving it by confusing their language so that they cannot understand one another, and so that they are dispersed over all the face of the earth, rather than building a centralized city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now, the author of Genesis repeats himself here. We've said previously that when studying the Bible, we ought to pay special attention to repetition. And here the author says again that it was here that the Lord confused the languages of the earth and dispersed them over the face of all the earth. And so here's what I've found myself wondering as I've studied the text. First, yes, it seems that God is concerned about pride. He wants some things to still be impossible for humans, absolutely. But as I think about this in terms of ethnicity and culture and tribes and tongue, I've begun to wonder if perhaps even beyond that, the problem is that they have not scattered. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 1, God gave the instruction for humans to be fruitful and multiply. Could it be that his intention was for us to spread out, and in doing so, develop various ethnicities and tongues? Now we know from Revelation chapter 7 that every people, tribe, nation, and tongue will be present around the throne of the Lamb. So if having multiple languages, confused languages, is a problem, then I can't help but wonder why that's still present at the end. We know from Revelation 7 and from Acts chapter 2, the story of Pentecost, that God doesn't undo the diversity of languages, but rather brings it into unity of purpose, namely the worship of God and the witness to God. And so here's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if perhaps Babel is a discipline for a purpose, a divine purpose that God is going to bring forward in chapter 12 when he invites Abram into a covenant to be a blessing for the nations, rather. I wonder if what God is doing here is freeing them from what comes from sameness. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Could God be saying, I know what happens when people are so homogeneous, and it's going to get in the way of the blessing for the world. This oneness, this sameness, perhaps would inhibit his intention that all of the nations of the world be blessed. And so he disperses them, and in doing so, frees them from building the world in their own image. Here's the thing, we need more than sameness. We humans, we need the richness of diversity. Without it, we cannot actually see who God is, because it's in our diversity that we reflect the image of a triune God. We need it in order to see all of the richness of who God is. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope this was helpful. Certainly, as I've studied, it's given me a lot to think about. If it was helpful, feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you next week. We're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 12 and on God's interaction with Abram, that he might be a blessing for the nations.